there, BookTube. Now, I'm making a Victorian recipe, chutney, and doing a video about that. But it's quite a slow process. So while I'm doing my chutney-related chopping, I thought I'd quickly record a tag ready for Tag Tuesday. So by the time this comes out on Tag Tuesday, I imagine that the Victorian chutney video will already have. I'll already put that out, if that makes sense. But let's go for it whilst chutney making. Okay, and the tag I'm going to do is the Victorian Literature Tag. And I'm doing this one because it was created by the original group of Victober hosts for the very first Victober in 2016. And I know that Kate and Katie were certainly already involved at that point, but there were a few other sort of different hosts that year. And what a good thing they started. Well done, Victober inventors in 2016. Anyway, as part of the original Victober, they did this tag, but it's still going around every Victober. Some people do it, and this is my first Victober as a content creator, so it's my turn. And I found it and was reminded that it existed on the channel For the Love of Classics by the booktuber called Risha, and she lives in Dubai, and she's a real enthusiast for classics, including Victorian literature. So thank you, Risha, for reminding me, and here's my answers. So question number 1, the first piece of Victorian literature you ever read. Now, this was a surprisingly challenging question for me, because actually when I started thinking about it, I realised that a lot of the books that I read and enjoyed as a child were Victorian. And it's probably less true of children now, but certainly, you know, back then in the 1960s, Victorian children's books were still kind of relatively common reading, or they were in my family. So, I mean, Alice in Wonderland, everybody knows, and obviously that's a Victorian classic, and Alice Through the Looking Glass. Coral Island, Children of the New Forest. Did you know that Thackeray, who wrote Vanity Fair, wrote a book that was, well, I don't think intended as a children's book. It was called The Rose and the Ring, and it was a bit of a kind of like a almost fantasy satire. But it was, by the time I was a child, it was considered a book for children. Charles Kingsley, The Water Babies, that was really about drawing attention to the horrors of child labour and chimney sweeps, but was a beautiful book. My 2 favourites of the Victorian children's books that I read as a child would be the books of George McDonald. He wrote At the Back of the North Wind and The Princess and Curdie and The Princess and the Goblin. Loved those. And the others I absolutely adored were the books of Nesbit, like The Story of the Treasure Seekers and The Phoenix and Carpet and 5 Children and It. And then I think by the Railway Children it had tipped over into Edwardian probably, but wonderful, wonderful, glorious books. So those were the first Victorian literature I read, various bits of children's literature. My question number 2 is your favourite Victorian novel. My favourite Victorian novel is Middlemarch by George Eliot, and it's not just my favourite Victorian novel, it's when people ask that impossible question like, oh, what's your favourite book, Ros? You know, and it's like, oh, how difficult to identify just one book to be your favourite. Middlemarch is the one that I always say, because it's such a rich and beautiful book. Your favourite Victorian author? Well, obviously then it follows that George Eliot is also my favourite Victorian author. Question number 4, your favourite Victorian literary couple. Okay, I've just been reading Bleak House, so I'm going to pick a favourite Victorian literary couple from that. And I'm not going to pick the sort of romantic leads, as it were, of that story. I'm going to pick Mr. and Mrs. Bagnet. And just because they seem to be the happiest match of husband and wife that I've come across in Victorian literature. They obviously really love each other, and they're like a slightly older couple. You know, they've got like young children. You know, not old, but you know, they're like they're not a love story couple, but they are, because they are so mutually supportive and thoughtful and kind. And one of the best bits in Bleak House is the story of Mrs. Bagnet's birthday, and Mr. Bagnet on her birthday insists on cooking her like roast chicken, and he won't let her touch it, and he'll go off and he'll choose the chicken at the market, and he always gets like sold the stringiest old birds they can get away with, and then he cooks it really badly, and she has to like sit there and be delighted and not interfere when he's burnt, you know, letting it burn, or you know, getting it wrong. And it's just, you know, and you know, it's like it's just really touching. So they're my favourite Victorian literary couple. My favourite Victorian villain is, well, I'm going to cheat and pick two. Okay, my favourite Victorian villain, who's like obviously a villain, is Melmotte in Trollope's novel The Way We Live Now, and he is a swindler. Yeah, he's tyrannical, he's manipulative, he ruins people's lives. Yeah, a brilliant character, very attractive, interesting character, really good book. But the person that I hate most, I think, in all of Victorian literature is Angel Clare in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and he's kind of not meant to be the villain, but he is the villain. And you know, Alex d'Urberville is like you know, the bad character, but Angel Clare is the one who really ultimately ruins Tess's life, and I hold him responsible, and so yeah, he's the one. Question number 6. Favourite Victorian book where someone dies of consumption? Well, you're spoilt for choice, aren't you? I mean, virtually every Victorian book seems to have someone die of consumption in it. But your classic, it's tuberculosis, obviously, is what the disease actually is. The classic one, though, is Helen Burns in Jane Eyre. That has to be the best consumption death in Victorian literature, if that makes sense. Yeah. Longest Victorian novel you've read? I think that it's Dombey and Son. I'm not 100% sure, because depending on what edition you've got, I tend to read them on Kindle anyway. Middlemarch, Bleak House, they're all long, but I think Dombey and Son is probably, that's knocking on 900 pages, I think, so it will be that. Question number, and a very good book too, by Charles Dickens, obviously. Did I say that? Yeah, I mean, you know that, you know it's by Charles Dickens. Really enjoyable, and actually I think I read that for last Victober, before I was made videos, if you know what I mean, inspired by Katie, of books and things. Question number 8, Victorian author or book you love and feel is underrated? Okay, I'm going to pick Mrs. Craik, or Dinah Craik was her proper name, but you know, there's a tendency, when I first read books by her, like when I first read books by Elizabeth Gaskell, they used to be called like Mrs. Gaskell and Mrs. Craik. It was like, rather than having their first names, unlike like say Emily Bronte or whatever, who was always called that. Does that make sense? Because they were married, I suppose, and a bit more respectable. Mrs. Craik wrote a book called John Halifax Gentleman, which was a favourite book of my mother's mother, my grandmother, who was, as I say, born a Victorian, and she loved Mrs. Craik and John Halifax Gentleman, and my mother read it to me when I was a sort of older child, because it's a bit of a coming of age sort of novel. It's quite kind of moralistic in a well, it's about, yeah, coming good, you know, like by virtue and effort, I suppose. I'd always forgotten of the existence of Mrs. Craik until I saw, again, Katie of Books and Things enthusing about another of her books, a book called Olive, and again, I read that for last year's Victober and really rediscovered what a good writer Mrs. Craik is. Olive's really interesting because it's a book about a disabled woman Victorian, who makes a life for herself and doesn't compromise and carves out an independent career despite her being kind of not considered marriageable because of her disability, and ultimately finds happiness through autonomy. Good book. Anyway, so an underrated one. Underrated author. Question number 9. Most beautiful edition of a Victorian book that you own. I have a Victorian edition of Thackeray's Vanity Fair. I will find a picture of it to share at the end of this this film, because I don't want to touch it with my cooking fingers because it's like really nicely bound, but it belonged to one of my grandfathers, again, who was a Victorian. I think he got as a school prize in 1898, so it's not just a Victorian book, it's also a Victorian book, if that makes sense. Question number 10. 3 unread Victorian books you want to try. Well, I've read a lot of Victorian literature, but there's also a hell of a lot of it, and there's loads more that I want to read. One would be Odd Women by George Gissing. I keep hearing people this Victober talking about that one, and I enjoyed New Grub Street by George Gissing, and that's the only book by him I've read, and I think whereas Odd Women sounds like a kind of proto-feminist novel and quite intriguing, so that's one I fancy. Another one is Ruth by Elizabeth Gaskell. When I was in my teens, I kind of thought I'd read everything that was available by Mrs. Gaskell, but I wasn't aware of Ruth or Sylvia's Lovers, and so I'm embarking on rereading some Elizabeth Gaskell, but I'd also like to go to find Ruth, which is about a fallen woman in Victorian terms. Looking forward to that one. And then I'm going to cheat with my third choice, because my third choice is not one novel, it's a group, because basically I really, really, really want to read the rest of the Barsetshire Chronicles by Trollope. I've read a couple and enjoyed them so much, and I keep meaning to go back to them, and somehow they're never at the top of the pile because I just know that they'll be there. That's the thing. That's the beauty of Victober, isn't it? Because those books that I know that I want to read but kind of don't go to because there's always something new and current, Victober helps prompt me to actually read them. So yeah, it's a good thing. Then question 11 is the bonus questions, which I think Katie added to Kate's original selection of questions, if it was Kate, so yeah. And these are to name your favourite novel by 5 Victorian authors. Now, you can tell that this was Katie's bonus question because her 5 Victorian novelists that she asked you to name a favourite of don't include George Eliot, because she has a strange prejudice against George Eliot. It's a mystery to me how someone as discerning as her doesn't love George Eliot as much as I do. But there we go. So she picked. She said your favourite Bronte novel. My favourite Bronte novel is Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte, or possibly The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. Both really interesting, much more realistic novels than the novels by her sisters Emily and Charlotte, and more feminist in a way. Yeah, good books. Your favourite Dickens novel? My favourite Dickens novel, now that's a good question, because my favourite Dickens novel has changed over the years. I think when I was in my teens, my favourite Dickens novel was David Copperfield. In my 20s, my favourite Dickens novel was A Tale of Two Cities. In my 30s, I think my favourite Dickens novel was Great Expectations. And in my 40s to 50s, my favourite Dickens novel was Our Mutual Friend. And this year I've read Bleak House for Victober, and I wondered if it might pip Our Mutual Friend as my favourite. It certainly was a very great joy to read. It's possibly the best thing I've read so far this Victober. It's wonderful. But having done a bit of heart searching, I think Our Mutual Friend is still my absolute favourite Dickens. When I read Dickens, I have a sense of connection with another of my grandparents. My grandfather, Lancelot Hope, was a huge Dickens fan. And you know what? Dickens, this always intrigues me. That grandfather was born in 1879 and Dickens died in 1870. So when my grandfather was born, Dickens was like less than 10 years dead. And when he started reading Dickens as a boy, Dickens was not a classic author. He was like a recently deceased, relatively contemporary author. Isn't that interesting? But he carried on reading Dickens all his life and still loved Dickens when I knew him as a small child. Your favourite Hardy novel? Return of the Native. That's my favourite, but I love loads of them. Your favourite Elizabeth Gaskell novel? That would be Wives and Daughters, although I'm planning on rereading Cranford to see if that moves up my preferences now I'm older. Yeah, it's not romantic like the other Gaskells, and yeah, we'll see. And your favourite Anthony Trollope novel? And that is The Way We Live Now, which is one of his standalone books and is, as I say, the one with Melmotte as the dreadful villain. And it's so contemporary in its themes. Brilliant book. I highly recommend it. There we go. So that was the Victorian Literature Tag. I'm not going to tag anyone because I've got no idea who's done it since 2016. But you've just got time to kind of squeeze it in before the end of this Victober if you're doing kind of Victober-y things and you've never done this tag.